Okay, in this video, I want to go over the subject of convergence, which is, will the poorer countries catch up to the richer countries? Will the less developed countries eventually catch up in their output? Now remember, if they're going to catch up, they've got to grow faster than the countries in the developed world. Just like the slower runner has to run faster than the runners in front in order to catch up. Now, when I ask my students usually, like, do you think the poorer countries are going to ever catch up with the richer countries, the developed countries? Most of them think they won't. And I remember as a kid talking about it with someone, he said, they shouldn't be called the undeveloped countries, they should be called the never to be developed countries, because they're never going to catch up. I'm not that pessimistic. I think it's quite possible to catch up, just like South Korea was able to catch up in a fairly short amount of time. It's just that we need policy changes and get rid of some policies and the bad governments that are holding the countries back. But if that can be done, and the solution is different for every single country, if that can be done, then I think the countries can catch up. For some countries, it's just that they've got a dictator with no property rights, or some countries that won't trade, or a whole host of different problems for different countries. Okay, the way economists check to see if convergence is going on, they do something like this. They go back in time, say like 1970, and they look at what the output per capita is in different countries. They take a whole bunch of countries and see what the output per capita was in some period in the history. And then they look at what the growth rates were for each country. So on the y-axis here, we'll plot the growth rates of different countries and plot it. Now, if there's convergence, what should we see when the regression is done? Well, we should see the poorer countries growing faster. So if we look at poor countries, they should be up here. If we look at some richer developed countries, they should be down here. So if we plot all the countries and say 1970, have a scatter plot, run a best fit line, a regression through them, we should see a negative association. If we see that, then it should mean that the poorer countries are growing faster and are catching up, and we will have convergence. So what do you think the data shows? Take a look. Okay, this graph shows on the independent axis, the x-axis there, the output, real GDP, we'll get into that later, but this is the output per person in 1960. On the vertical axis is the growth rate from 1960 to 2000. Okay, well, this ended 20 years ago, and we could certainly update the graph. But what does this graph show? Is there convergence in the world? Well, there sure isn't, according to this graph. In fact, the regression line looks a little bit positively sloped, which would mean the poorer countries are becoming further away from the richer countries. They're not converging, just the opposite happening. They're getting left further behind. Now, it might be because of policies that we went through, all these other things that are going on. What do you think would happen if we did a graph like this but we only included the states in the United States. In other words, we went back in time and we looked at every single state in the United States and their income per person, and then their growth rate for the next 40 or 50 or 100 years after that. Do you think we would see convergence? Now, this is interesting because we looked at different states in the United States. They all have a lot of similarities. They all have the same institutions for the most part. They have similar geographies. They have similar corruption rates, similar human capital, a lot of similarities. So should the poorer states in the US catch up to the richer states? What do you think? Well, here's the graph. This is the growth rate from 1880 to 2000. So looking over 120 years. And the output per capita is on the x-axis. And you can see the scatter plot and the regression line. And it looks like when we're looking at states that are very similar, that there is convergence. At least there's convergence in the United States between states. So not convergence between countries in the world, because there's so many different political systems and things going on, revolutions and coups and property rights and so forth. We don't see convergence. But if they're all pretty similar, yeah, then we do see convergence. Here's a graph of just the OECD countries. So we're the developed countries, going from 1960 to 2000. And if you just look at these developed countries, that are all very similar in a lot of ways. Are the poor countries of the developed countries, do they converge? And the graph is definitely downward sloping, a negative relationship, showing, yeah, there is some evidence that amongst the developed countries, there is convergence. Okay, so in this module with growth, we've gone through, we've looked at the growth rate, determined what's important in the growth rate is productivity. And it's important to be able to understand the level of income or output in a country versus the growth of that income. Just because a country has a higher level of income doesn't mean they're growing faster. If there's convergence, just the opposite. We went through what the issues in growth are, which is, why do countries grow? That's the big one. Why do some countries grow faster than others? And then we went through all these different things that might affect productivity. All the things in the production function, really. Labor, capital, human capital, technology, and then maybe a whole bunch of other stuff too, that in the production function tends to be just lumped into that category of technology A. We went through the capital labor ratio, which just means more capital per person. And when there's more capital per person, we call that capital deepening. We went through the production function and some examples of what production empirically turns out to look like. And that is something like capital to some power less than 1 and times technology, which is a power to 1, times labor to some other power that is less than 1. In actuality, these numbers turn out to be something like 1/3 and 2/3. And then we went over the subject of convergence. One more graph I just want to show you real quick. Here is a graph of the United States growth rate. And what you can see from this is it's a logarithmic scale, which means a growth rate of like 3% is a straight line. And those red lines are 3% growth rates and a little narrow band around them. And what you can see is that the US tends to grow at about a 3% growth rate over time. That's what we've grown at for 100 years. And you can see that it's really within a narrow band that we grow at this growth rate. It kind of goes up and down a little bit. That's the business cycle that we'll go over later. Sometimes it's up and down. There's depressions and recessions. But overall, we still end up growing at about 3% a year. What we want to do, one of the most important things about growth, is we want to figure out a way that we can grow at a higher growth rate. Just pushing up the 3%, from 3% to 4%, would make a big difference over time in our standard of living. The other purpose of this, of studying growth, is to try to figure out why the poor countries are poor and to help them increase their growth rate so that their incomes can be brought up to the rest of the world.